So, welcome to the second lecture in the core curriculum of the DFT school. So, I'll be talking about DFT models, and I first want to point to the nature of these models. So, generally, DFT models are neural process models of sensory motor behavior and of cognition, and they really form a spectrum that is spanned by how close and realistic the link to the sensory motor surfaces is, and that range in which this link is varied amounts to defining different kinds of interfaces between experimental observations and model. And I first want to take you through a couple, and then I'll expand on one of those. So there's the large class of dynamical field theory models that are essentially made to account for behavior, for experimental observation in psychophysical experiments. And the simplest form of those, and the most popular so far, are the ones in which there is some form of mapping by the modeler of the model or states of the model to behavioral states or to behavioral measures. And I'll illustrate that around the reaction time paradigm that I will be referring to later. So if you model a reaction time experiment, essentially you're modeling then a set of experimental conditions, something that was varied. Here in this example, set size in a visual search task was varied. And that set of experimental conditions is mapped onto a set of inputs to the model that you explicitly model. You write down these input functions and say that function corresponds to that condition of the experiment. And then in many cases, these experimental conditions involve time. There's a sequence of events happening in an experiment, like a ready, steady, go, or a go signal, or multiple stimuli presented. And then in the experiment also you're observing something. People generate a certain behavior, movement behavior or something that you record. So in reaction time you would, for instance, measure the time to initiation of the movement from the go signal. And then you compare that to a particular event in the model. For instance, an event where you measure the time when activation reaches a particular criterion level. And that, for instance, how reaction time was measured here in a model. So that is a class of model that has this sort of a modeler interface, very common in psychology. And I will now be lecturing about models like that in the next hour. This can be expanded by having models that also account for behavior, but that link the models to more realistic sensor or motor systems. So here's an example in which you see a little video actually playing, and this complex model that deals with relational cognition is driven by that video, extracting features from that video, color features, and then generates a response that in this case is a categorical response, some neurons going on and others going off. So it still accounts for the decisions, the behaviors in this task, but it takes real sensory inputs. And you will actually be seeing models like that later in the course. Raoul Greben will talk about that. The first slide was actually from his talk. And Mathis Richter will be talking about that. And maybe Daniel Sabinas will be talking about that as well. And okay. Now, another interface that DFT models may have is with neural data. So for instance, in that case, you're mapping particular states of the model onto particular neural observations, neural measures. So here's an example from a paper a couple of years ago in which time courses of voltage-sensitive dye imaging on visual cortex, shown here on the right, are modeled. So the simulations here are meant to match that condition, and the stimuli here on the left are the stimuli supplied to the animal when the recording was made, and also supplied to the model as formalized as inputs in a certain way. So that's a style of modeling that we've done quite extensively. I've briefly touched upon that in the lecture where I showed you motor cortex. This is data from motor cortex. I showed you this slide time course of population activation, where this is where a peak forms here, and this is a different condition where the peak is broader, and then we actually modeled that the field was made to match the neural data. In the summer school, we will not have a lot about that. There's a lot of work in this direction. John Spencer, Aaron Buss, and others are working very intensely on that. But in this year's edition, this is not so prominently represented in the school. Then there's a very different way of how that interface can be expanded, and that's by, in a sense, accounting for behavioral competences. And we do that by linking the models to actual motors and sensors. In this case here, for instance, the model is linked to a robot arm that really drives a robot arm, and it gets sensor information from a camera. It's up here. And what we're doing is demonstrating a particular competence. In this case, this is online updating. The fact that when the object is moved around, the robot corrects its movement in response to that change. And so what happens in a model like this is that the dynamical architecture is solved numerically on a computer in real time as it receives input and it describes the robotic arm. And the scenario emulates something that we want to show, in this case online updating. And so very typically it's some qualitative demonstration of a behavioral competence. It's not something that is meant to account quantitatively for any behavioral result. So Jan Kulve, for instance, will be illustrating this sort of demonstration of DFT models. In my group, we do a lot of that. And finally, there is a even more radical version of that, in which you're not only linking your DFT model to actual sensors and motors, but you're actually also implementing it not on a computer numerically, but on a neuromorphic hardware that simulates the nervous system in a lower level. So neuromorphic chips that in some form, and this is an instance of doing that in actual analog electronics, and there are other cases where digital electronics approximates analog electronics. And in this case, for instance, a vehicle that's shown here at the bottom has a camera that is a DVS, event-driven camera that essentially emulates electronically the spike generation of photoreceptors and has certain properties of the retina. And then on that chip, the DFT architecture is implemented and then actually really acts out the behavior. So that's sort of the ultimate demonstration of behavioral competence, where you would do both the neural processing and the behavioral competence in the same model. That's sort of the spectrum, very interesting, right? And actually we'll have Julia Sandemiska, who's heading that kind of direction of applying DFT, and is now with Intel, and she will be giving a lecture this Friday on this very topic. So that's the survey over the spectrum, in a sense. And now I'll be focusing on the first type of model. I'll just give you highlights of that and show you how to use DFT models to account for behavior quantitatively, how to fit behavioral data. So I'm going to take the example of making selection decisions. So it's paradigms where along some dimension you have multiple options. The input specifies, let's say, here in this example, 2 locations, and you can either maybe select one or select the other. And selection, so we'll use mappings where it's a macroscopic state, a peak, and then we'll interpret that peak as leading to a certain behavioral outcome. And then the input, the conditions are model whatever the paradigm is. So selection decisions happen all the time. We do that all the time. The most dramatic example would be the saccadic target locations that you select afresh every approximately 300 milliseconds. You're looking around all the time, putting your fovea to different places in the environment, and that's very fast and unconscious to a large extent. You can control it a little bit, but most of the time you're doing that unconsciously. It is maybe the best studied paradigm of something like free choice, where you're just doing whatever you want to do. And so in DFT, that's a core phenomenon, because DFT really accounts for how these decisions are stabilized, as I illustrated last lecture, a peak will form at one location and the activation at the other location will be suppressed. While if you think of the selection decision just being a readout problem done by some downstream structure that would just, like winner takes all, just take the parameter value or the dimension, the value of the underlying dimension at which there is most activation, then you would be switching around as neural activity fluctuates. So that's why it taps into core properties of DFT. Now, if you look at this saccadic situation, that's actually how we started modeling with DFT. We started in the mid-90s with Klaus Koppitz by accounting for decision making in visual saccade selection in the laboratory. We looked at the transition from averaging to bistable selection. So when you have an initial fixation light and then a target comes on, when the targets are sufficiently close so that you can foveate both at the same time, you tend to perform a saccade that goes into the center of the target. When they're further away, you tend to select one of those targets. And it's a fast phenomenon. I'll show you some detail about that in a moment. And we accounted for that essentially in the paradigm that I just hinted, where a bimodal input would lead to bistable selection of either one or the other location. And we could account for this transition into into averaging, which came about essentially by excitatory interaction filling in here this little local minimum. There's a lot of phenomena we were able to study that way. For instance, the metrics and probability of these choices matters in the averaging mode, but not in the bistable mode. That was one result. Now, there's an interesting wrinkle to that. If you look at the time course of decision making, this is from the model, but data look exactly like that. So time course of decision making, you find that if you have different latency between when the stimulus is presented and when you make the response, then the early fast responses tend to average, while the late responses tend to select. This would be in the double target paradigm. You can also have a paradigm where you actually tell people which target to go to, for instance, by color, and you find that the fast saccades are still averaging, and only if you have enough time to process the stimulus do you actually select the appropriate target. In these experimental paradigms, the latency is manipulated actually you manipulate that by manipulating the fixation conditions. So, for instance, you remove the fixation stimulus before the target comes on, and that accelerates the initiation of the saccade. So you get some of these fast points from the so-called express saccades. Now that's an interesting phenomenon. You could wonder about, how do we understand that from the point of view of neurodynamics? And I elaborate that point because it actually adds something to the theory. Because actually so far we've been cheating a little bit from a neuroscience point of view, because we've assumed that there is this activation field that has both excitatory and inhibitory coupling, which are required to make the peak. But neurophysiologically, we know that neurons only form one type of synapse on the neurons that they project onto. It's either excitatory or inhibitory. That's why we're talking about excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons. Some people call this Dale's law. And so this is a violation, right? You can't have both excitatory and inhibitory from the same neurons. Now, the fields are a little bit more abstract anyway, so it's they are collective descriptions. But the time course issue that I raised, really has to do with that aspect. So what you need to be consistent with Dale's law is to say that inhibition is mediated by so-called inhibitory interneurons. That is, you have a population of excitatory neurons. Now, excitatory neurons are the ones that do the work in the end, they will generate motor activity. And then you have neurons that are driven by that excitation, but they are inhibitory. That is, when they project, they make inhibitory synapses. So you have a little loop where excitatory neurons excite inhibitory neurons, which then inhibit excitatory neurons. And this sort of extra layer that you have to go through gives rise to that time course. And briefly flash these equations. Chapter 3 of the book contains a discussion of these so-called two-layer fields. This is the math of those fields. So it's not really dramatically different. You have this activation, your minus u plus resting level plus input. And this is self-excitation. So now you have a kernel that is only excitatory. That will be this kernel. And then inhibition comes from a different population V, which has its own equation. That will be the equation of the inhibitory layer, which has the same structure, minus V plus a resting level. And that inhibition is driven by input from the excitatory field. So excitation couples in here and does inhibition in return. The self-excitation is mediated by the field directly. That's the generic form, so-called the Amari form of that. There are other variants of this in the literature. This picture creates that time force. And you can think quantitatively that there would be sort of three regimes when you apply an input to a system like this. That is in resting state, let's say. There would be initially the input-driven state when input drives the field up to threshold, when the input goes into the excitatory layer, and when the excitatory layer starts to become suprathreshold, excitatory interaction can engage. Inhibition is only driven once that's the case. So inhibition will arise as soon as there is positive excitation, excitatory activation. And that means excitatory interaction has already engaged. And inhibition, of course, needs to reach its threshold in order to then drive the inhibition. So inhibition arises with a delay. It's not that the inhibitory neurons per se are slow. They are actually fast in terms of time scale, but they have this time they need to go to threshold. Here is a sequence of simulations or time slices from simulation that illustrates that idea. So here is a simulation of a field that makes a target selection. This is saccadic endpoint. You see the input is bimodal, two locations. This is 10 milliseconds after the stimulus was presented, and you see the field is still below threshold and really is a low-pass filter of the input. So it's really just input dominated, and that's still the case here approximately at 25 milliseconds, where you see there's still a trough here. But then at 80 milliseconds, this trough has been filled in by excitatory interaction, right? From the left, from the right, fills in that field. So you see here the transition from input-driven to excitatory interaction dominated. And then finally, on a different time scale, see these are much larger times than the times I'm having here. And using this gray level plot, you see here you see the bimodal, that will be the early phase. This is where the excitatory interaction makes it monomodal, and then you see here the field actually selects the rightmost location. If you run that under different conditioning, it might choose the leftmost location. So this is where inhibitory interaction comes in. And this generates that time course. So again, actually this is data from simulation, and you have experimental data that look just like that. So that's an interesting signature of the time course of neural activation. There's more data like that than I want to go into. I mentioned the two-layer field because they generate time structure, for instance, as oscillation or also as active transients. That's important for movement generation, and it's important for sequence generation. I'll be coming back to that in a later lecture. In this course, we're not actually expanding so much on movement generation, but I'll hint at that briefly tomorrow in the embodiment lecture. Now, so these kinds of experiments are rare and far, not very common. So experiments where you're just allowing participants to make their choices, because if you do that without clear instruction, then you get cognitive strategies and all kinds of problems. Eye movements are like that, and babies. I'll end the talk today on babies. On babies, you can do experiments because they don't have a lot of cognitive strategies. Most experiments in the laboratory are a little bit different. I first want to point out that they are really important. I took this example because it is really the core of cognitive psychology. I mean, if you think through that, almost everything you measure about cognition entails some form of selection. You have to select the right response for a particular stimulus. And in these paradigms that are used to study cognition that way, very typically there is what we call an imperative signal. That is, there is a stimulus that really uniquely specifies what the correct response would be, and therefore you have correct, and then you have errors. And you vary different qualities of the task. So for instance, you vary the nature of the imperative stimulus, how clear it is, how unique it is, how confusable it is with other possible answers, or stimuli that might suggest other answers, and some of that. And you might vary, the alternatives, task set. I'll say something about that in a moment. Or you might vary how familiar people are with the task, whether they have learned the patterns before and after learning, and so on, and other factors as well. So this idea of task set is really important. Psychologists, it's regrettable that theoreticians, and especially neurally driven models, often don't deal with that well enough. So task set might be classically number of choices, probability of choices. Again, what I mentioned, the perceptual quality of the stimulus and so on. The task set is known to the participant before you present the imperative signal, for instance, by instruction, or because there's a perceptual layout. There are 5 buttons, so it's going to be one of those 5 buttons you have to press. Or more commonly, for instance, a lot of animal experiments, by learning, by having experience across trials, the sort of things that can happen. And because it has this temporal order, we talk about it as pre-shaping the underlying representations, and the pre refers to before the selection decision is made or because it is initiated. So here's an example of how that would be accounted for in the field, where you would have at some point a specific input, an imperative input that might be, for instance, this red line, an input over a dimension that will be localized over the movement parameter, let's say, that you really have to perform, or specifies the movement that you're going to make. But that input doesn't arrive at a field that is totally flat. It's a field that is pre-shaped, reflecting the kinds of choices that arise. So for instance, here I assume there are 3 possible movements that you might have to make, and we call that then the task input, so that the field is pre-shaped in this by their superposition. That's this green line. This would be all below threshold, right? The field hasn't really engaged a peak, and what would happen when you apply the red input, which is large enough to push the field through the detection instability, is that then a peak would be formed, and the peak is self-excited, as you see here, above threshold, suppressing everything else. So so this notion of pre-shaping the field is key to a lot of the accounts for different kinds of experiments. So I'll be focusing on the reaction time paradigm for now, just to be concrete. And this is sort of roughly how these paradigms are typically conceived in experiment. And so you have a task set. Let's say this human has to grab either the cup or the book, and that would be define the perceptual qualities that are relevant to the task itself, and the range of options. And then you get an imperative signal. Let's say here on a computer screen, let's say you have get the cup as what you have to do. And in many paradigms, this imperative signal that tells you what to do is also the signal to go, the go signal, although there are experiments where you can separate these two. And then at some point you respond. For instance, you initiate a movement in the right direction, and the time before you begin that response is the reaction time task. And so it's generally thought to be informative about the computation that is implicit in the task. That's how it was classically viewed, and we'll view it as being reflective of the dynamic process of generating activation that drive the response. So in the spirit of these kind of models, what you have to do is map the experimental conditions onto inputs to the model, and then take measurements on your model that map onto measurements on the human behavior. So for instance, in this case, you might have different conditions, different inputs. The pre-shape would be just one input, and maybe a specific input varies in metrics. And this illustrates that there can be often 2 dimensions to your input a specific component that tells you which choice to make and a boost component that will be a go signal. And that as a result of that, let's say your field generates a peak rather than another peak, and reaction time could be interpreted as being the time when a particular criterion level is reached. So for instance, a threshold like that is reached, you're looking at this time as a reaction time under these different conditions, for instance. This is really just to make the interface with the data. It's not actually assuming that the response is really generated by doing that. The response is generated by having a motor system that is driven by the activation. I'll talk tomorrow about how we think of that actually happening. So this is just to create an interface with the model. So doing that in old work with Wolfram Erlhagen at the very beginning of our journey in dynamic field theory, we modeled a lot of classical paradigms that way. For instance, the classical Higgs law that the reaction time increases with the number of choices. Here is an increase like that for different stimulus-response compatibilities. It increases roughly logarithmically, and that is accounted for by the task set, by the fact that the field is pre-shaped, having little peaks at multiple locations, all sub-threshold. And essentially, as you have more peaks like that, they have a small inhibitory influence on the field as it arises, and therefore, with a lot of choices, the maximum location in the field arises later than with a fewer number of such choices. And it turned out that we can understand in detail these reaction time curves from that kind of theory. Now that's very classical, it's like 50s. It was a surprising aspect when we did that an effect that we called the metric effect turned out to be somewhat surprising. And so that we were going for a metric effect has to do exactly with this notion that we have these very simple models with very simple assumptions about kernels and the homogeneous coupling, and then we're looking systematically for signatures that this postulated structure, neural processing structure, leaves in behavior. And so we were asking for metrics because we know the distance between field site matters for input superposing and for interaction being excitatory or inhibitory. And so we looked at in the model at how a two-choice task reaction time would be different for metrically far versus metrically close choices. And we found that metrically close choices would have faster rise of activation, so shorter reaction time, than metrically close removed choices. It's really because the preshape overlaps, so the activation at the close choice sort of boosts activation at the far choice, at the other choice. If they're far, they don't overlap so much. That's sort of counterintuitive because you would think reaction time should be faster if the choices are easier to discriminate. And in fact, there are some perceptual cases where that other effect called distance effect is observed. We also model that now, but I'm going to skip that. But so the metric effect is the opposite of that. It turns out that is empirically true. It was historical curiosity that I had just moved to Marseille into the lab where Jean Lequin, who died unfortunately a couple of years later, worked. He was the director of the lab, and when I told him this story, he said, "Oh, I've published data like that years ago. Nobody paid attention. It was published in a French journal because it was difficult to interest anyone in it, and it actually showed exactly that effect. And that data is very complex, but actually still very useful. We a couple of years later reproduced that kind of data, and I'll show you an example here. This is a very simple pointing task where you point from one location, have to go into 2 different or 3 different movement directions, and we just vary the angular range between these targets. And there's all kinds of things that you have to make to optimize, to control for attentional effects and so on. But roughly what you see is reaction time increases with the separation, the metric separation between the choices. So the metric effect is observable. And here's actually a more sophisticated version of that. Sophisticated for psychologists, that in psychology statistical interaction is actually a safer way to measure such effects because it gets rid of any not theoretically predicted dependence on substance matter. So here in the theory, we're comparing in a two-choice task the reaction time when one of the targets is low probability and the other target is high probability. So high probability is modeled as more preshape than low probability. This is the same, but a larger difference in probability. And in each case, the high probability target has an earlier rise of activation than the low probability target, and that effect is increased if the difference in probability is larger. Well, in this contrast, we're looking at the same difference in probability, but now the choices are metrically close. And as you see, that metrically close case reduces the advantage of probability. It's called the Hyman effect, the advantage of high probability. Now the low probability choice is also fast. It moves in the direction of the high probability choice. That's the prediction. And this is the experiment. Essentially, same sort of two center out pointing task, very small. Again, attention effects well controlled. We're always looking at the same target as being the rare target, and the frequent target is either far or close, so wide condition, narrow condition. And what I draw attention to is that here's the Hyman effect, that is the rare target has a larger reaction time than the frequent target under the wide condition. And when you move them close to each other, then they have the same reaction time, and they have the faster reaction time as the same reaction time, exactly as predicted. And there are a couple of controls in the experiment. It's much more complex, has all kinds of balancing conditions, and we also looked at P300, but that's the core message of that. So there's a whole battery of experiments that, essentially all classical motor-related reaction time tasks were accounted for us in that paper that some of you will be reading for your exercise. Now, we actually initially weren't so eager to go into classical reaction time studies because it's kind of old and it's not a paradigm that's very natural for dynamic field theory. So instead, what we actually looked at in detail were experiments that are in a paradigm that's sometimes called time movement initiation paradigms. Goes back to someone called Schöner in the 60s, and Claude Guez and his colleagues in New York worked very extensively on that in the 90s, roughly. It's a paradigm where you're forcing participants to respond at a particular time. So for instance, you give a metronome, and then on the fourth tone you have to respond. And you vary the amount of time between when you provide the imperative stimulus and when that go signal comes. And people can learn to do that. So here's an illustration. You have a tone. For instance, there might be a pitch, beep, 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 the fourth tone. So you can predict when it's going to happen. And then at a particular stimulus response interval, you're getting the information about which movement to make. Here, for instance, is isometric forces, and you know it's going to be this force level that I have to do, and there are 6 possible force levels, 3 up, 3 down, and then you do that, the movement. And so with that, you can, by varying this interval, you can vary, observe the time course of your decision making in a way. So here are examples in the paradigm I just hinted at, where there are 2 directions and 3 amplitudes. This is where the large amplitude was specified, middle and small. And these are movements in the wrong direction, so categorical errors. And so a couple of interesting things. First, you see sort of a graded evolution. So you have a default distribution here around the center. It's always the same in all 3 conditions. The default is around here, the center of these 3 amplitudes, and then you have a graded shift. In fact, there are some conditions where you have intermediate values that are never specified that you move to. You do have some categorical errors. Sometimes you go in the wrong direction. They peter out if you leave enough time. If you specify from the start the average movement, then it's sort of stationary, and here it moves in the opposite direction. Again, having intermediate values that are not ever specified. This is the histogram looking way of analyzing that in 3 epochs. And again, you see it's the sharpening if it's the middle choice, and then you see the systematic drift with some values in the averaging values in between. And that's something that one can easily account for in the model. This is how the model and predicts that, and this is the experimental results. And essentially what you're seeing in the model is that you're seeing how the preshape is in a graded way transformed into the peak that then drives movement. In fact, you can make measurements, in a sense, behavioral measurements on that preshape. So it's a very interesting wrinkle on that. So here's a case where they studied the metric effect. They varied the metrical angle between the choices. They also varied amplitude, but I'm just looking at direction right now. And you find here this superposition of different stimulus response intervals. The earliest ones are the ones with these dotted line, the thin line, that the histogram is of that nature too. And you see that for this choice you have a monomodal distribution, so you're going to go for the sort of the average choice. While if you open the choices, then the earliest time still has a peak in the middle, but then later times you get a bimodal distribution. And then around between 60 and 90, the initial distribution transitions from monomodal to bimodal. So you can sort of literally measure the width of the preshape and at which time it becomes bimodal. And that turns out to match approximately the preshape that we are inferring from these the neural data. I'll show you those data in a moment. And there are other manipulations. Maybe I'll skip this one here. So here's the neural data. I already hinted at that when I talked about the neural foundations in the previous lecture. So we're reconstructing from neural firing of about 100 neurons in motor or premotor cortex, the population distribution of population activation defined over movement direction. So in the movement parameter space, right? Not on the motor cortical surface. So in that experiment, we actually had different conditions in which monkeys were given different information, prior information before the go signal. Here at this time, the response signal, reaction signal was given, and that told the monkeys exactly which movement to make. So here the monkey knew it was going to be target 2, and there was just a go signal, while here the monkey knew it was going to be one of these 2 targets, and at this point the monkey was given that information, which of those 2 becomes real, and there's a condition where it's 3 targets, and then the monkey selects one of those 3. And as you can see, we can estimate from the distribution of population activation where the local maximum is, and you see that right after the preparatory signal is given, the maximum is already positioned on the correct choice. It's over 6 choices, and here is 2 or 3. And then only when the response signal is given does the distribution shift toward the correct distribution. So in a sense, we're literally seeing the prior information in cortex, while previously we saw it, in a sense, in behavior. In this data, one can actually establish a link. Establish a link between the amount of activation and reaction time. So you can look at the trials where the monkey was faster than median or slower than median, and then the faster is the ones where at the response signal there was more activity. So it starts from a higher level, just like the way we accounted for the magic effect in the model. Now that would be an example of really going all the way down to neural level to look for signatures of the field in an experiment. This is all about selection. I'm going to just say a little bit about other regimes of our dynamical field theory that link to experiment other ways. So in decision making, we're seeing these subtle influences that show up in reaction time and in the metrics of responses, because we're looking very early in movement, and very early the system isn't yet at exactly the right choice, and therefore we have some sensitivity. And the other limit case in which you can get signatures of the underlying metrics is in the working memory case. In the working memory case, you're also not really driven by input anymore, because the input is gone, and so you can also see subtle effects, metric effects. And so this is the paradigm where you set a peak, but then you're measuring the peak later. And so John Spencer developed this spaceship task in which he probes spatial working memory. He did that to do that also with children. And this is from Anchati's thesis data, where she had children of various ages from 3 to 10, I believe, point to a location in a workspace at which a stimulus that was supposed to be a spaceship was shown previously. So, for instance, the finger would initially be here, and this is where the spaceship appears, and then a delay is imposed in various ways. For instance, also counting set, ready, set, go, and then at the end of the delay, the child is motivated to go to that spaceship and point at it, even though by that time there is no perceptual marker at that location. So in the actual experiment, the surround is not visible; it's all in the dark, and this is a translucent computer screen, so the stimulus is presented on that table. Various methods of motivating the kids to keep going, to do that at the right time with rewards, and so on. So the sort of things that you see, what you do is you vary the spatial layout of the targets. This is from an experiment where there are always only 3 possible targets in every condition. There's one in the center, one on the left, one on the right, symmetrical. So in one condition it's -20, 0, 20, the other is -40, 0, 40, and so on. And so what you find is that there are really 2 effects. There is a mean effect, that is participants drift away from midline. So if they are, let's say, at a 20% target, then they are further away from the 20-degree target, outside, away from midline. And then the variance increases, so the uncertainty increases. This might be very natural in that that's essentially a signature of drift. It's sort of the Brownian motion kind of idea that as you have no more perceptual information about where your response is anchored, you're more variable across time. And both of these effects can be accounted for by our model. This is also an interesting story behind that, because initially the theory that inspired John Spencer to do that was our Erlangen model predicted the opposite, predicted attraction to the center of these 3 targets. And it turned out that attraction is actually in the data, but it is superposed on a repulsion from midline. And so that repulsion from midline is actually repulsion from a landmark, and the midline was a landmark in some cases. So the complete model has a landmark entry, and the inhibitor interaction from that landmark drives the target away, and we can account for that in detail. It reflects that the metric work memory is unstable. So John Spencer and his students have expanded this paradigm. I mean, there must be like 30 publications where they've looked at this in color space and orientation space, and varied all kinds of aspects of this task, frequency, bias, and a lot of things, and have been able to account for all of that data in terms of these very simple interaction kernels. So very, very limited number of parameters to account for quantitatively for complex data. Working memory is a very so this shows that the metric drift that is implied by the concept of working memory, marginally stable states, is real. I point you here to 2 papers that will be in the PDF slides that give a review of this recently, and there's a lot more. And in this summer school, Sebastian Schneegans will be talking a little bit about aspects of that in his talk, but not exactly in using DFT models, but using, it's very related. We'll be talking about that. So the last example I want to take you through combines everything. Everything I said, every instability is in there. It's actually work that really was at the beginning of us using DFT to account for behavior effects. I have to say a little bit about learning in DFT, which will be useful in general, because that plays a role in that model. So I'll be very brief about that. So learning, of course, generally learning is just change of behavior based on experience, right? And because experience is driven by activation patterns in DFT, the behavior is generated by neurodynamics. So learning amounts to change of the neurodynamics driven by the activation patterns that result from the neurodynamics itself, right? That's the simple definition of learning from experience. You see that we also sometimes call this autonomous learning. It's learning not by some external supervision. So for instance, back propagation, error-based learning and so on is really more something like fitting, right? It's not actually accounting for the processes of how that learning would occur. So to understand autonomous learning, how actual behavior leads to learning, you first have to understand how behavior is generated through a process model like the ones I'm discussing. And then you have to understand how these models modify themselves based on their own inner states. And there's a lot more to be said about that. But here I was just roughly align this with things you know. So for instance, I think all of you know about Hebb's rule. Hebb's rule says that different neurons when that are connected, when they are co-activated, will strengthen their connectivity, and that is something that makes sense in neurodynamics. Once they have two different fields that are that some connection matrix WXY connects and that are co-activated in some way, then the connection strength could evolve according to the Hebb rule. This is a dynamic version of the Hebb rule, goes back to Grossberg many years ago. And so that works. In fact, we'll be using these kind of learning rules, especially for different dimensional fields. I'll refer to that back, and Matthias Richter will be talking about that. And Jan de Kulve will be talking about that. Is, for instance, zero-dimensional field is a single node that is connected to a field through a set of connections, and we'll see how that node can come to be connected to a particular region where activation arises. So I'll point to these other talks, including the talk by Daniel Sabanas. Now, more basic is what we sometimes call the zeroth order Hebbian learning, which corresponds to the bias input in neural networks. And that is a form of learning that isn't actually correlative, so it doesn't depend on two neurons co-varying their firing. It's just a form of learning in which any firing leads to a change of probability of firing. So here's the field dynamics, and the memory trace would be just an excitatory input into that trace, essentially increasing the resting level. I forgot to put the X here. It depends on where in the field. It's local, and so it's like a local modification of the resting level. And so the idea is that when you have a peak in the field at some point, then you lay down a memory trace in this memory trace field, which is not really, it doesn't have interaction. It's just a memory low-pass filter of the field with a slower time scale. And that memory trace then activates through this input the field. So those of you who know about neural networks remember the bias term is one input that doesn't come from other neurons. It's just a autonomous input that puts this neuron closer to firing or not. And in neural networks it doesn't have much significance, but in dynamic field theory it has a strong role because we can amplify such small differences into macroscopic activation patterns through the boost-driven detection stability, as I pointed out. So you can think of the memory trace as reflecting somehow the statistics of where peaks arose. So for instance, if you have a paradigm where you induce peaks here sometimes and here sometimes, the memory trace will reflect that statistics. And the particular way we model that is that suprathreshold activation in the field lays down a memory trace, and that means whenever there is an input here, memory trace goes up, but where there is no input, memory trace goes down. So you see here, for instance, goes up, and then because memory trace is now built here and not here, then it goes down again. While if there's no input, so between trials, or memory trace doesn't evolve. So it's not totally volatile. It just has competitive interference. And that's a good description of what behaviorally happens. And this form of memory trace is actually a good description of what happens in terms of building priors of probabilistic effects. In our original paper, we showed, for instance, that with that memory trace, you could build a preshape distribution that reflects the statistics of choices. So if you very frequently have one choice and less frequently the other choice, the memory trace builds up for the frequent choice and is at a different level for the less frequent choice. If you switch the probability, then it will actually track that kind of probability. So it's a good model for that kind of thing. So, and it's been tested, used to account for a bunch of data like that. So here's the paradigm that combines everything. It's the A not B paradigm, out of sight, out of mind sometimes, framed as that. So Jean Piaget is studying small children. It's actually, he did armchair kind of experiments, but it has been since the whole industry of studying this very in detail. And infants, this is an infant seen from the top, are presented with a box classically, which has two troughs and a lid. This red thing is a lid, and you would hide a toy that they might be looking at as attractive in the A lid, impose a delay, and then push the box into the reaching space, and the infant will go for the lid and maybe go for the toy. You do that a couple of times, and then you hide the toy under the alternative lid, impose that delay, and then you find that the infant may make the A not B error, that is, go to the original A lid. It isn't really about out of sight, out of mind. That was something that was framed. And in fact, there is a so-called toyless variant. This is a photo from Linda Smith's lab where an infant is just going for the lids. There is no trough, it's just the lids. And you're just attracting attention to the lid and then do the same procedure. And then the infants very happily go for that lid that you made attractive by waving it or banging it and so on. And you similarly see then a perseverative tendency to go to the A lid if you attract attention to the B lid on a B trial. So it's essentially a sensory motor decision task that you're biasing by that input. And you can model that by thinking of the multiple inputs that can play a role here. So for instance, the fact that there are lids gives some task input, and the fact that you're banging the lid on one side or you're showing the toy can be the specific or imperative input. And you could think of the memory trace that is being built as these kids are reaching being a preshape input. And all of those would be inputs to a single activation field that we can think of as a field that reflects motor intention. So it could be literally the movement direction in motor premotor cortex. Of course, we don't really know. In infants might be also supported by multiple cortical and subcortical structures. There's actually a fourth input that we overlooked in our original model, because there's a difference between the box being in reaching space or not, because infants typically do not try to reach for an object that's outside of reaching space. And we'll model that by assuming that that gives a boost to the field and that induces peaks. So what happens is that this thing actually does all the instabilities that we're looking at. There is detection in the sense there is the formation of a peak to express the motor goal at some point. There is selection, which of the two locations makes a peak. There's the memory trace. There is boost-driven detection, that is when you push into the reaching space, a small difference is amplified. And there is a memory instability in the sense that young infants are modeled by are well accounted for by assuming that they don't have sustained activation while older infants have. So roughly what happens is that when you're driving the system by input at A, peaks form at A, at the appropriate point kids reach for A, and that reaching and the peak lays down a memory trace. There is some activation at B just because of the perceptual layout. And when you do that a couple of times, so these peaks have a chance to decay during the delay, and after the delay, you're pushing the field through detection instability by the boost, and then the peak will arise at the location where there is maximum input in some sense. And the idea is that the young infants would typically, on the B trial, the peak at B is not sustained. It has time to decay during the delay, and so after the delay, the activation pattern is dominated by the memory trace after a couple of trials, and therefore when you now boost the distribution, it will respond at A, while the older infants are able to a larger extent to stabilize the peak, the intention they had, while the object is not in reaching space. And then when it comes into reaching space, the boost will amplify that peak and they will not make the mistake. And with that account, we could account for a whole bunch of data, and I will actually return to this tomorrow in the embodiment section and show you some quantitative aspects of this. The aspect I want to emphasize is that the role of the memory trace and the fact that decisions have consequences. So here's an example from a simulation where this structure of the task is modeled by inputs to the model. So this is a activation field across space. These are the two locations at which reach to A and reach to B would be modeled. This is time that is organized by trials. These are the 6 A trials and the 2 B trials. In every case, you see this little activation that will be the specific input when you're presenting the model with a input at the A location. See it decays. This is a young infant. And then you add this ridge. This would be the boost that reflects that the box is put into reaching space, and this brings up a peak that leads to reaching, and it brings it up here at this location because it's still a little bit of an advantage of this location over that location. You see a little bit of a higher level here because of the task input, because you see the lid at B, which would also make it possible to build a peak here. As you reach to A, memory trace is laid down, which increases here over time. See, second trial, again, you Q, boost, respond, Q, boost, respond. So a couple of trials very reliably moves to A, and then you present the peak at the input at B, and when you boost, goes to A. And it's because there's a good memory trace that overcomes this little transient activation that used to have at B. And so this is the example of the field making the mistake. So the memory trace leads to the perseverative error. Now it's interesting now that about 20% of the babies make what are called spontaneous errors. That is, on an A trial, this is the 5th A trial, this input here, but the model and the infant reaches to B, makes a spontaneous error. And it will therefore lay down a memory trace, and the memory trace at A will decay, and therefore the model, as well as such infants, is actually correct on B. So when the B trial comes, it responds to B. It doesn't respond because it's now able to switch. It actually switched earlier stochastically. It's because there's more memory trace now at B than at A. So that's interesting because that means that it's not just a matter of making the decision by reading out the maximum location. I contrasted that initially in discussing selection decisions as being that contrast between input-driven and interaction-driven behavior. And here, the decision is a macroscopic peak, and that macroscopic peak leaves a memory trace, and that then has consequences in the future. It's a strength, right? I'm expressing that here. And here is a quantitative prediction from that fact that shows that this is a good account. And what this shows is a bit complicated. It shows two things. First, it shows the probability of infants making spontaneous mistakes. So as a function of how deep you are into the series, the probability of the infant making a spontaneous error, there's all A trials, a spontaneous error increases a little bit and then ends up being around 20% or so. It's always, you only make a measurement on an infant once. Do this once per infant. So there's 400 infants in this data set. This is from Esther Thielen's lab, the infant data, and then we model that. The increase to trial 4 actually has to do with the fact that in many of these paradigms, the lid is not positioned perfectly symmetrically. It's actually a little bit closer to the infant on the A trial. It's called training trials, which actually also have an interesting role. We modeled that, but I don't want to go too deep into the details. So that's can be understood why that increases. Now the prediction is that when you're looking now at the grain line, you're looking at the conditional probability that if the infant made the spontaneous error just previously, how probable is it that it will repeat it? And you see that that is it's a much higher level, so it's about twice as likely, and the model accounts for that as well. And that is really the signature of that memory trace being laid down by that spontaneous decision, by that decision having an effect on future decisions, so decisions having consequences. You might immediately think, well, maybe it's just because those infants who make these mistakes have a side bias and they just always go to that location. Actually, we tested that, and that predicts a very different time course, and that can be excluded. So it's really due to that laying down of the memory trace. Okay, with that I want to close and just say that these models in which DFT models are mapped onto experimental conditions and measures, even though the interface is limited, and they are still process models, and this last point really shows this very clearly. Process models that show the consequences of neural processes in behavior. I will expand that interface in my next lecture tomorrow, and talk about embodied DFT by really showing how these activation states come about from extrasensory input and how they can actually drive motor behavior. And there's some new elements needed to understand that. And in the rest of the course, we'll see more and more elaborate models that expand that interface. Well, thank you for your attention, and see you soon.